And it is very, very...
The story opens with a young Peter Parker stepping into his father's private study. The moment he enters, he realizes something is wrong. Drawers have been pulled open, papers are scattered everywhere, and the entire room looks as though someone has searched it in a hurry. Before Peter can understand what happened, his father, Richard Parker, rushes inside. Clearly alarmed, Richard gathers several important files and quickly packs them away. Not long afterward, Peter's parents take him to the home of his Uncle Ben and Aunt May. They leave their son in the couple's care, offering Peter no real explanation for why they are going or when they might return. Confused and frightened, the young boy can only watch as his parents disappear from his life. Years pass, and Peter is now a high school student. He is intelligent and observant, but also quiet, socially awkward, and more comfortable keeping to himself. Most of the time, he tries to stay unnoticed and avoid situations that could bring him trouble. Unfortunately, that does not stop Flash Thompson and his friends from targeting him. One afternoon, Peter sees Flash humiliating another student in front of a crowd. He initially tries to ignore what is happening, but eventually decides he cannot stand by any longer. Peter steps forward and confronts Flash, even though he knows he is physically outmatched. His attempt to defend the victim quickly turns against him, and Flash brutally beats him in front of the other students. The fight only ends when Gwen Stacy arrives and orders them to stop. She pulls the boys apart and prevents the situation from becoming worse. Later, Gwen speaks privately with Peter and tells him that standing up to Flash took real courage. Her compliment catches him off guard, and for the first time that day, Peter allows himself to smile. That evening, Peter helps Uncle Ben clean out the basement. While sorting through several old belongings, he comes across a briefcase that once belonged to his father. Curious, Peter carefully examines it and discovers a hidden section built into the case. Inside, he finds documents connected to Richard's scientific work. Peter studies the papers and learns that his father had been employed at Oscorp alongside a scientist named Dr. Kurt Connors. Wanting to know more, Peter searches for information online. His research reveals that Richard Parker specialized in cross-species genetics, an experimental field involving the combination of traits from different organisms. During the search, Peter also comes across reports confirming that both of his parents died in a plane crash. Still desperate for answers, Peter visits Oscorp the following day. Since he has no official permission to enter the research facility, he assumes the identity of another student, who was supposed to attend an intern orientation. Using the stolen credentials, Peter manages to slip inside with the rest of the group. Once there, he is surprised to see Gwen. She is not merely visiting the company, but working as one of Dr. Connor's senior interns. Gwen immediately recognizes Peter and asks why he has come to Oscorp. Thinking quickly, Peter claims that he has always been interested in science. She clearly suspects there is more to the story, but instead of exposing him, she quietly warns him not to do anything reckless. As Peter moves through the facility, he notices a man carrying files marked with the same unusual symbols that appeared on Richard's documents. Believing they may be connected to his father's research, Peter discreetly follows the employee through the building. The man eventually enters a restricted biocable development laboratory and leaves a short time later. The moment the corridor is empty, Peter sneaks into the room. Inside, he discovers a large experiment involving genetically engineered spiders. The creatures have been modified through advanced scientific procedures and are suspended throughout a complicated web-like system. Fascinated by what he sees, Peter reaches toward one of the strands and pulls it. His curiosity causes the delicate setup to malfunction. The containment system breaks apart, sending dozens of spiders raining down over him. Peter panics and quickly brushes them away, unaware that one of the creatures has crawled beneath his collar. Before he can escape the laboratory, the spider bites him on the back of the neck. While traveling home on the subway, Peter begins feeling strangely disoriented. A group of men notices him and decides to provoke him, expecting him to be an easy target. However, when they attack, Peter's body reacts almost automatically. His reflexes have become incredibly fast, allowing him to avoid every punch and grab with ease. Even Peter does not understand how he is moving so quickly. His strength and coordination seem to have increased dramatically, and he effortlessly overwhelms the entire group. What should have been a frightening encounter turns into a chaotic display of abilities he never knew he possessed. After reaching home, Peter examines himself in the mirror. As he looks closely at the bite on his neck, he finds the strange spider still clinging to him. Realizing the creature came from the Oscorp laboratory, Peter begins to suspect that the bite has somehow changed him. By the next morning, those suspicions are confirmed. His senses have become unnaturally sharp, his speed has increased, and his body is far stronger than before. He also possesses extraordinary balance, agility, and reflexes resembling those of a spider. Ordinary movements now require careful control because Peter has not yet learned how to manage his new strength. Hoping to learn more about Richard's work, Peter later visits Dr. Connors at his home. He introduces himself and reveals that Richard Parker was his father. Connors is stunned to discover that the son of his former research partner has come looking for him. Once he understands who Peter is, Connors explains that he and Richard had been developing a method of cross-species genetic regeneration. Their goal was to use the biological abilities of certain animals to restore missing human tissue and even regrow severed limbs. The research was deeply personal for Connors because he had lost his right arm and dreamed of creating a treatment that could make him whole again. However, Richard disappeared before the work could be completed. Without his knowledge and calculations, Connors was unable to solve the final problem, leaving the project unfinished for years. After hearing this, Peter remembers the formula hidden among his father's papers. He writes the equation on a small piece of paper and hands it to Connors. The scientist studies it and immediately realizes that Peter may have provided the missing element needed to complete their research. Amazed by the discovery, Connors agrees to continue discussing the work with him, and the two arrange to meet again the following day. Back at school, Flash is playing basketball in the gym. During the game, he deliberately harasses a girl by spilling ink across her work. Peter sees what happened and walks over to help her clean the mess. A basketball suddenly flies in their direction, but Peter catches it with one hand before it can strike her. Flash notices the impressive save and comes over to take the ball back. Instead of backing down as he normally would, Peter decides to use his new abilities to embarrass Flash. He easily keeps the ball away from him, moving faster than Flash can react. Peter jumps, spins, and dodges around the court while the other students watch in disbelief. For once, Flash is the one being humiliated, but Peter loses control of his strength during the confrontation and accidentally destroys the basketball hoop and backboard. Because of the damage and the apparent fight, Uncle Ben is called to the school. He is disappointed when the staff explains that Peter has been using his strength to bully another student. Ben does not know the full story, but he believes Peter should have handled the situation more responsibly. Before they part ways, Uncle Ben reminds Peter that Aunt May finishes work later that evening and asks him to pick her up. Peter agrees, but his attention is already focused on his secret meetings with Dr. Connors. On his way to Oscorp, Peter tests the limits of his transformed body. He runs across rooftops, leaps between structures, climbs obstacles, and practices parkour through the city. With each movement, he becomes more comfortable using his speed and agility. At Oscorp, Dr. Connors uses the formula Peter provided to conduct a regeneration test on a laboratory mouse. The animal is missing a limb, making it the perfect subject for the experiment. After the treatment is administered, Connors and Peter watch closely as the mouse begins regenerating the lost body part. To their amazement, the procedure succeeds. Excited by the breakthrough, Peter loses track of time. When he finally returns home, he finds Uncle Ben waiting outside. Seeing him there, Peter suddenly remembers that he was supposed to collect Aunt May from work. Ben is furious that Peter ignored the responsibility he had accepted. He explains that Aunt May was forced to find her own way home because Peter failed to appear. During the argument, Ben mentions Richard and tells Peter that his father believed strongly in honoring personal obligations. In Richard's view, when someone has the ability to help another person, they also carry a responsibility to follow through. Peter bitterly asks what any of that matters now, since his father abandoned him and is no longer part of his life. Overcome with anger, he storms out of the house before Ben can respond. Aunt May urges her husband to give the boy some space, believing Peter needs time to calm down, but Ben refuses to let him wander the streets alone and goes after him. Still upset, Peter enters a nearby convenience store and tries to buy a bottle of milk. When he reaches the counter, however, he realizes he is short of money. The cashier refuses to let the small difference slide and dismisses him without the drink. Moments later, another customer pulls out a weapon, robs the register, and bolts from the shop. The thief passes directly by Peter, but Peter, still irritated by how the cashier treated him, makes no effort to stop the man. Outside, Uncle Ben is searching the area for Peter when he suddenly sees the robber fleeing. Ben attempts to intervene and wrestles with him, hoping to prevent his escape. During the struggle, the gun goes off. Ben collapses to the pavement while the thief disappears into the night. Peter hears the commotion and races toward the gathering crowd. When he pushes through the people, he finds his uncle lying motionless on the ground. He kneels beside Ben, but there is nothing he can do. By the time Peter reaches him, the man who raised him and stood by him for years is already dead. The loss devastates Peter. Ben was more than an uncle to him. He had been his closest companion, father figure, and one of the few people who truly cared about him. Knowing that he had the chance to stop the robber only makes the grief even worse. Peter withdraws from everyone around him and sinks into guilt and depression. At school the following day, Flash approaches him. Peter immediately assumes that the bully has come to provoke him again. Before Flash can say anything, Peter grabs him and slams him against a locker. This time, though, Flash does not fight back. He quietly explains that he only wanted to say he was sorry about Uncle Ben. His unexpected sympathy leaves Peter uncertain how to react. Gwen also tries to comfort him. She approaches gently and wraps her arms around him, hoping the gesture might ease some of his pain. Peter accepts the embrace, but the grief has buried itself too deeply. Even Gwen's kindness cannot pull him out of the emotional state he has fallen into. Later that night, Peter wanders through the city alone. While walking through a rough neighborhood, he encounters a group of criminals. His anger immediately rises as he remembers that Ben was murdered by a thief much like them. Looking for somewhere to direct his rage, Peter confronts the gang. The men attack him together, but Peter uses his enhanced reflexes, strength, and parkour movements to overwhelm them. He flips over obstacles, avoids their strikes, and launches himself across the narrow alley with ease. During the fight, Peter makes another remarkable discovery. When he is thrown against a wall, his hands and feet cling to the surface, allowing him to crawl upward without falling. After realizing he can scale walls, Peter begins testing the ability throughout the city. From that night onward, he hunts criminals whenever darkness falls. His main objective is to locate the robber responsible for Ben's death, so he searches for men matching the thief's description and questions them after defeating them. Although his campaign begins as a personal mission of revenge, Peter unintentionally starts protecting ordinary citizens along the way. He interrupts robberies, stops violent attacks, and prevents criminals from escaping. Stories about the mysterious masked vigilante gradually spread through the city. During one pursuit, Peter crashes through the roof of an abandoned wrestling venue and lands inside the old ring. As he looks around, he notices a discarded mask once worn by one of the performers. The sight gives him an idea. If he is going to continue operating at night, he needs a way to hide his identity from criminals, witnesses, and the police. Peter first designs a simple face covering, then continues improving his appearance. Using his intelligence and knowledge of science, he creates a flexible spandex suit that will not restrict his movements while climbing or fighting. He also builds mechanical web shooting devices that fit around his wrists. The web shooters use a specially developed fluid capable of producing incredibly strong strands. Peter practices firing the material at walls, buildings, and distant objects until he learns how to use it for movement. Before long, he is swinging between structures and traveling across the city above the streets. With the complete suit, mask, climbing abilities, and artificial webs, Peter develops a new public identity. Residents begin calling the unknown hero Spider-Man because of the way he crawls across walls and swings through the city. Not everyone welcomes his presence. The police consider Spider-Man a dangerous vigilante who interferes with official investigations and delivers his own form of justice. Captain George Stacy, Gwen's father and a senior police officer, leads the effort to identify and arrest him. One evening, Spider-Man catches a thief and playfully humiliates him rather than immediately turning him over. Peter hangs the criminal with webbing and jokes while the man struggles helplessly. Before he can finish, police officers surround the area and aim their weapons at him. The officers order Spider-Man to surrender, but Peter refuses to be taken into custody. Using his speed, he avoids their attempts to grab him, fires a web toward a nearby building, and swings away before they can stop him. Meanwhile, Dr. Connors faces growing pressure inside Oscorp. His superior, Dr. Rajat Ratha, demands that the regeneration serum move immediately into human testing. Ratha argues that the treatment could soon allow injured patients and amputees to regrow missing limbs. Connors strongly objects. Although the mouse experiment succeeded, he knows the serum has not undergone enough testing to determine whether it is safe for humans. He refuses to risk innocent lives merely to satisfy Oscorp's schedule or financial interests. Ratha has no patience for his concerns. He removes Connors from the project, dismisses him from his position, and takes control of the regeneration formula. Ratha intends to continue the human trials regardless of Connors' warnings. After losing both his research and his job, Connors returns home in despair. Years of frustration over his missing arm, combined with the fear that his life's work will be taken from him, push him into making a reckless decision. Rather than waiting for further testing, he injects the experimental serum directly into his own body. The drug immediately overwhelms him, and Connors collapses unconscious. When he eventually wakes, he notices something extraordinary. His missing right arm has completely grown back. For the first time in years, he has two functioning limbs. His excitement does not last long. The serum begins causing severe changes throughout his body. His skin hardens, his features distort, and his physical size increases dramatically. Within moments, Connors transforms into a massive reptilian creature with enormous strength and animalistic instincts. Now fully changed, the creature leaves in pursuit of Dr. Ratha, determined to stop him from taking the serum and using it on human subjects. Around the same time, Peter is invited to dinner at Gwen's home. He meets her family and sits at the table with Captain Stacy. During the meal, the conversation turns towards Spider-Man. Captain Stacy openly criticizes the vigilante, arguing that a masked individual cannot be allowed to decide who is guilty or ignore the law whenever he chooses. He confidently states that the police will arrest Spider-Man sooner or later. Peter, unable to remain silent while hearing his alter ego condemned, argues that Spider-Man is trying to protect people. He describes the vigilante as someone serving the public when the police cannot arrive in time. Captain Stacy challenges Peter's defense, and the discussion creates an uncomfortable atmosphere at the table. Neither man realizes just how personally invested the other is in the argument. After dinner, Peter and Gwen step onto the terrace for some privacy. Gwen senses that Peter has been hiding something and asks him to explain his strange behavior. Instead of answering directly, Peter reveals the truth in the most surprising way possible. He shows her that he is Spider-Man. Gwen is stunned, but Peter quickly proves it by using his abilities. The revelation changes the mood between them. Peter admits how deeply he cares for her, and the two share a kiss. Their private moment is interrupted when Captain Stacy receives an emergency call. Reports have come in about a dangerous creature attacking people near the Williamsburg Bridge. Captain Stacy immediately leaves to respond, and Peter secretly follows soon afterward. When Peter reaches the bridge, he sees the enormous reptilian monster throwing vehicles across the roadway and sending cars toward the edge. Drivers and passengers scream as traffic collapses into panic. Peter quickly changes into his Spider-Man suit and begins firing webs to stop the vehicles from falling. He anchors cars to the bridge, pulls passengers away from danger, and moves rapidly between the wreckage. Connors notices Spider-Man's arrival, but chooses not to continue the confrontation. Before Peter can get close enough to identify him, the reptilian creature escapes from the area. Peter then hears that a young boy remains trapped inside a vehicle hanging beneath the bridge. The car is suspended by webbing and could fall at any moment. Without hesitating, Peter climbs down and enters the unstable vehicle. The frightened child refuses to move. He is overwhelmed by the height, the damaged car, and the masked stranger attempting to help him. Realizing that the mask is making the boy even more afraid, Peter removes it and hands it to him. He tells the child that wearing the mask will make him brave and asks him to climb towards safety. The gesture earns the boy's trust. Peter carefully guides him out of the car and returns him to his father before the vehicle falls. Despite Spider-Man's actions on the bridge, the police take full control of the investigation the following morning and officially issue a warrant for his arrest. Peter is deeply discouraged when he hears the announcement. He has risked his life to protect strangers, yet the authorities continue treating him like a criminal. Still suspicious about the reptilian attacker, Peter visits Dr. Connors' office and asks what kind of creature could have appeared on the bridge. Connors looks exhausted and physically unwell, but he attempts to remain calm. He suggests that a genetically altered reptile might behave aggressively when frightened or threatened. His answer is vague, and he quickly ends the conversation by claiming he is occupied with a major new project. As Connors moves around the room, Peter notices a container used for the regeneration serum sitting nearby. The evidence, combined with Connors' strange behavior and newly restored arm, leads Peter to a disturbing conclusion. Connors did not merely create the drug. He injected himself with it and became the giant reptile. Determined to prevent another attack, Peter goes to the police station. He approaches Captain Stacy and tries to explain that Dr. Kurt Connors is the creature responsible for the chaos on the Williamsburg Bridge. Peter explains that Dr. Connors used reptile DNA in an attempt to restore his missing arm. According to Peter, something inside the formula went wrong, causing Connors to transform into the enormous lizard-like creature seen on the bridge. Captain Stacy listens, but the story sounds too unbelievable. He dismisses Peter's claims as a wild theory and sends him away without launching an investigation. With the police refusing to take him seriously, Peter decides that he must deal with Connors himself. He searches for a place where a giant reptile could remain hidden and eventually turns his attention toward the city's sewer system. Believing the creature may be living underground, Peter enters the tunnels and sets up a camera, hoping to capture proof of its existence. It does not take long for Connors to appear. Once again, the serum takes control of his body, transforming him into the towering reptilian monster. He attacks Peter inside the confined tunnel, and a violent fight breaks out beneath the city. Peter uses his speed and webbing to keep his distance, but the narrow sewer gives him little room to maneuver. Connors' transformed body is far stronger than before, and he repeatedly smashes Peter into walls and pipes. In the middle of the battle, Peter's web shooters malfunction and stop firing. Without his webs, Peter loses his main advantage. The lizard pins him down and prepares to tear into him. Peter barely manages to escape, using the environment and his remaining strength to break free before disappearing deeper into the tunnels. After Peter flees, Connors notices the camera that was left behind. When he examines it, he sees Peter Parker's name written on the device. The discovery immediately reveals the truth to him. The masked vigilante interfering with his plans is Richard Parker's son. Injured from the fight, Peter later climbs into Gwen's bedroom. She is shocked by his condition, but quickly helps clean and bandage his wounds. As she treats him, Peter confesses that he feels responsible for everything that has happened. He explains that Connors could never complete the regeneration experiment until Peter gave him Richard's missing equation. That formula made the serum possible, and now it has turned Connors into a dangerous creature. Peter believes that because he helped create the problem, he must also be the one to stop it. The next day, the situation becomes impossible to hide. Connors enters Peter's school while transformed, sending terrified students and teachers running through the corridors. He has come specifically to find Peter and attacks him inside the building. Peter manages to change into Spider-Man and uses his webs to avoid the creature's claws and powerful strikes. Their fight tears through classrooms, hallways, and the school library. Desks are thrown aside, walls are damaged, and students flee as the two battle across the campus. Although Connors possesses overwhelming strength, Peter uses his intelligence and the objects around him to fight back. He traps the creature with webbing and repeatedly forces him away from the remaining students. Before the police can arrive and surround the building, Connors escapes. Knowing another attack is inevitable, Peter contacts Gwen and asks her to return to Oscorp. He tells her to use Connors' research to prepare an antidote capable of reversing the mutation. While she heads toward the laboratory, Peter returns to the sewer system to search Connors' hideout. Inside the underground laboratory, Peter discovers Connors' true objective. Connors no longer wants the serum only for himself. He plans to release it across the entire city and transform every resident into a reptilian creature. Connors believes human beings are weak and imperfect. In his altered state of mind, he sees the mutation as a form of evolution that will remove illness, disability, and physical weakness. To distribute the formula, he intends to place it inside a cloud-generating machine located at the top of Oscorp Tower. Realizing how little time remains, Peter immediately calls Gwen and orders her to leave the laboratory. Connors is already traveling toward Oscorp, and Peter knows Gwen will be directly in his path if she stays to complete the antidote. Meanwhile, the police divide their attention between the two targets. One tactical unit moves to intercept the lizard, while Captain Stacy and his officers continue hunting Spider-Man. Even with the city facing a giant monster, Captain Stacy still considers the masked vigilante a threat. The first police unit eventually corners Connors and manages to bring him down using heavy weapons and coordinated fire. For a moment, it appears that the creature has been defeated. However, the lizard possesses an extraordinary healing ability. His wounds rapidly close, allowing him to recover almost immediately. During the confrontation, he releases the experimental chemical among the officers. The substance infects them, causing several policemen to begin developing reptilian features. Elsewhere, Captain Stacy's team succeeds in surrounding Spider-Man. During the struggle, part of Peter's mask is removed, revealing his face. Captain Stacy is stunned to discover that the vigilante he has been pursuing is Gwen's classmate. Peter desperately explains that Connors is heading toward Oscorp Tower and that Gwen is inside the building preparing the only antidote capable of stopping him. He warns Captain Stacy that if the lizard reaches the dispersal machine, the entire city will be infected. Although hesitant, Captain Stacy finally recognizes that Peter is telling the truth. He allows him to leave so he can stop Connors. Unfortunately, as Peter attempts to escape, one of the officers accidentally fires his weapon and shoots him in the leg. The injury severely limits Peter's movement. He can barely place weight on the wounded leg, and every swing sends pain through his body. Even so, he continues toward Oscorp because there is no one else capable of reaching Connors in time. The father of the boy Peter rescued from the bridge happens to work in construction. When he sees news footage of Spider-Man struggling across the city, he realizes that the hero who saved his son is trying to reach Oscorp. Wanting to repay that debt, the man contacts the other crane operators working nearby. He instructs them to rotate and position their cranes in a straight path toward the tower. One after another, the machines move into place, creating a series of high platforms that Spider-Man can use as anchor points for his webs. The traffic police also begin cooperating. Streets are cleared, vehicles are redirected, and a route is opened beneath the cranes. With the city finally helping rather than hunting him, Peter swings from one crane to the next and steadily closes the distance to Oscorp Tower. Inside the laboratory, Gwen finishes creating the antidote just before Connors reaches her. She escapes with the container and finds her father. Gwen hands it to Captain Stacy and tells him that Spider-Man must receive it before the lizard activates the machine. Captain Stacy immediately heads toward the top of the tower. By the time he arrives, Connors has already begun overpowering Peter near the dispersal device. Peter is weakened by the gunshot wound and struggles to keep the creature away from the machine. Captain Stacy opens fire on the lizard, briefly forcing him back. He then gives the antidote to Peter, creating enough time for him to climb toward the machine and replace the mutagenic serum. Peter reaches the device and begins switching the containers. Below him, Captain Stacy continues shooting at Connors to prevent him from following. The lizard eventually attacks the captain directly, slashing him across the body and leaving him critically wounded. After disabling Captain Stacy, Connors climbs after Peter. He reaches the top of the tower and attempts to stop him, but he is already too late. Peter completes the sequence and activates the machine with the antidote instead of the regeneration chemical. A massive cloud spreads across the city. Rather than turning the population into lizards, the antidote reverses the mutations. The infected police officers regain their human forms, and Connors transforms back into an ordinary man. The damaged structure at the top of Oscorp begins collapsing. Peter loses his grip and falls from the tower, seemingly headed toward certain death. Connors, now restored and horrified by what he nearly caused, catches Peter before he disappears into the darkness below. Once he is safe, Peter rushes to Captain Stacy. The captain is still alive, but his injuries are fatal. In his final moments, he acknowledges that the city truly does need Spider-Man, even though Peter's role as a hero will create powerful enemies. Captain Stacy is especially concerned about Gwen. He knows that anyone close to Spider-Man could become a target. Before dying, he asks Peter to promise that he will stay away from his daughter and keep her separated from the dangers surrounding his double life. Peter reluctantly agrees. After Captain Stacy's death, Peter keeps his promise. He distances himself from Gwen and refuses to explain why he has suddenly become cold toward her. He does not even attend the captain's funeral, fearing that remaining close to Gwen will place her in greater danger. Gwen is hurt by his absence, but she eventually understands what happened. Peter's behavior makes it clear that her father asked him to stay away before he died. Though the realization is painful, she decides to respect the promise and accepts Peter's decision. Sometime later at school, Flash approaches Peter once again. This time, however, there is no hostility between them. Flash has completely changed the way he treats Peter and speaks to him as a friend. He is even wearing a Spider-Man shirt, unaware that the hero he admires is standing directly in front of him. Peter notices the shirt and compliments it, quietly amused by the situation. In the final scene, Spider-Man stands high above the city and watches several police vehicles race through the streets in pursuit of a criminal. No longer driven only by revenge for Uncle Ben, Peter now understands the responsibility that comes with his abilities. He fires a web toward the next building and swings after the police, fully embracing his. The biggest problem facing the Amazing Spider-Man begins before Peter Parker is even bitten. Why are we doing this again? That question hung over the film from the moment it was announced. Sam Raimi's first Spider-Man had only arrived 10 years earlier, and the final movie in that trilogy was still fairly recent. This wasn't some character returning after decades away from the screen. Audiences could still remember the previous Spider-Bite, the previous Uncle Ben, the previous costume, the previous lesson about responsibility. None of it had faded into cinematic history. So when this film starts walking through another version of Peter Parker's early life, it has to fight against a strange kind of impatience. We already know roughly where every road leads. Peter will enter a laboratory. A spider will bite him. His body will begin behaving differently. Uncle Ben will die. Peter will feel guilty. A mask will eventually appear. The details may change, but the destination is sitting there in plain sight. That does not automatically make the movie bad. Familiar stories can still work. Batman's origin has been told repeatedly. Superman's story has been reshaped for different generations. Even myths survive because each storyteller finds a different pressure point, a different emotion, some new way into material everyone already recognizes. The trouble is that the Amazing Spider-Man often changes the decoration without completely changing the experience. Mary Jane is replaced by Gwen Stacy. The Green Goblin is replaced by the Lizard. Organic webs are replaced by mechanical web shooters. Peter skateboards now. His hair is different. His clothes are different. The lighting is moodier. Yet underneath those changes, we are still watching Peter move through many of the same emotional stations the earlier films had already covered. That creates an odd tension. The movie wants to feel like a fresh beginning, but it also depends heavily on our familiarity with Spider-Man. It wants credit for being different while repeatedly reminding us how much of the structure remains the same. There are moments when the new direction nearly justifies itself. The mystery surrounding Peter's parents gives him a different reason to enter Oscorp. Gwen has a more active role than the romantic leads are usually given in this kind of origin film. Andrew Garfield's Peter carries himself differently from Tobey Maguire's version, and once he puts on the mask, the personality becomes much more sarcastic and physically loose. Those choices do create a separate flavor. This is not simply the 2002 movie performed by another cast, but it is close enough that the comparison never disappears. You can almost feel the film trying to outrun the memory of Raimi's version. It moves toward darker colors, more grounded technology, and a slightly more serious emotional atmosphere. Peter's powers are presented with more physical detail. He bruises, he stumbles. His movement feels less like a clean superhero pose and more like someone improvising with a body he barely understands. All of that is useful. It gives the reboot texture. Still, texture is not the same thing as necessity. The film reportedly cost an enormous amount of money, and you can certainly see that money on the screen. The effects are polished. New York looks impressive. Spider-Man moves in ways that were much harder to achieve a decade earlier. Yet the film's very existence keeps feeling tied to franchise maintenance rather than an urgent creative idea. It is difficult to ignore the business logic. Spider-Man is one of the most recognizable superheroes in the world. A studio is not going to leave that character untouched for long. There are sequels to launch, villains to introduce, mysteries to tease, and a larger cinematic universe waiting to be built. That doesn't mean the filmmakers had no artistic intentions. Mark Webb clearly tries to focus on Peter's relationships and loneliness. The actors bring their own interpretations. There is real care in parts of the production. But the movie still carries the unmistakable feeling of a property being restarted because it is too valuable to remain inactive. And that feeling matters because it affects how we watch the origin. Uncle Ben's death should be devastating. It is the moral wound at the center of Peter Parker's life. Here, though, a portion of the audience is not only thinking about Peter's grief, they are also thinking, yes, we know. We have been here before. That is not entirely the film's fault, but it is the burden the film chose to take on. There is something slightly exhausting about watching another version carefully arrange the same pieces. Peter argues with Uncle Ben. Peter leaves in anger. A criminal crosses his path. Peter makes a selfish decision. Tragedy follows. The emotional machinery is still effective in places, especially because Martin Sheen gives Uncle Ben genuine warmth, but the machinery is visible now. The audience knows what each scene is preparing. Some viewers will not mind that at all. Longtime Spider-Man fans may enjoy seeing details restored from the comics, particularly the web shooters and Peter's sharper sense of humor. For them, the reboot is not repeating the story so much as correcting or reinterpreting it. Others will see the same material and wonder why a few comic-accurate adjustments required an entire restart. That divide probably explains why reactions to the film can be so extreme. One person sees a fresher, more energetic Spider-Man. Another sees a polished imitation of something that was still fresh in the public memory. Both reactions make sense. Personally, I think the movie is caught somewhere in the middle. It has too much personality to be dismissed as a completely empty remake. Garfield and Emma Stone give the film a different energy. The visual effects are stronger. The romance has its own rhythm. The mystery of Peter's parents points toward another kind of story. At the same time, the reboot never fully proves that these changes could only have existed through another origin film. That is the key issue. A new Spider-Man movie was easy to justify. Another complete account of how Peter became Spider-Man was much harder. The film could have started with Peter already operating as the hero. It could have trusted the audience to understand the basics. It could have revealed the parental mystery gradually while moving into unexplored territory. Instead, it returns to the beginning and spends a large part of its running time rebuilding a character who never really left. By the time Spider-Man is finally swinging through the city, the film becomes easier to enjoy. Garfield's physical performance separates itself from Maguire's. The action has more speed. The character begins wisecracking. For a while, the question of whether the reboot was necessary becomes less important than whether the movie is entertaining. And yes, sometimes it is. That may be enough for a summer blockbuster. It may even be enough for fans who wanted a version closer to the Spider-Man they knew from particular comics. But good enough to watch and strong enough to justify starting over are not quite the same thing. The film's biggest opponent is not the lizard. It is recognition. Every familiar beat reminds us that we have already watched another filmmaker solve this problem, often with more warmth and a clearer sense of identity. The Amazing Spider-Man does manage to survive that comparison. It is not a disaster, and it is certainly more competent than the most hostile reactions suggest. There are strong performances, impressive effects, and enough interesting changes to keep it from feeling like a shot-for-shot repeat. What it never completely escapes is the suspicion that the reboot happened first, and the creative justification came afterward. The studio needed Spider-Man back on the screen. The filmmakers then had to find a reason for audiences to watch the beginning again. Sometimes they find one, sometimes they don't, and that uncertainty follows the entire movie. This version of Peter Parker is where the reboot makes one of its biggest bets, because Andrew Garfield is not playing the same kind of awkward outsider that Tobey Maguire played. He is still lonely, still intelligent, still carrying around the damage of being abandoned by his parents. But he does not really look or behave like the invisible kid at school. He skateboards through the corridors, dresses like someone who has at least a vague idea of what suits him, carries a camera, and has that slightly withdrawn coolness that tends to attract attention rather than erase it. The film tells us Peter is an outcast, and there are moments when that comes through, especially in the way he watches Gwen Stacy from a distance or struggles to say anything coherent when she actually speaks to him. But he never feels like the classic image of Peter Parker being rejected by the whole world. He feels more like a quiet, complicated kid who has chosen to keep people at a safe distance. That difference matters. His isolation is tied less to social humiliation and more to abandonment. Peter remembers his parents leaving him with Uncle Ben and Aunt May, and even though he was young, the feeling clearly stayed with him. He does not know why they disappeared. He does not completely accept the explanation that they died. Somewhere underneath the sarcasm and awkwardness, he is still waiting for an answer. So when he finds his father's old briefcase and begins following the trail toward Kurt Connors and Oscorp, it is not just teenage curiosity. Peter is searching for a missing part of himself. That gives the origin a more personal engine than simply wandering into the wrong science demonstration. At the same time, the film sometimes pushes so hard to modernize Peter that it loses a little of what made him distinctive. The skateboard is the obvious example. There is an entire stretch where he uses it to test his developing coordination, and I understand the intention. It is visual, youthful, and gives Garfield something physical to do before the costume appears. But it also feels like someone in a meeting said Peter Parker needed to look more current. The same thing happens with his attitude. Garfield's Peter is not especially meek, even before the bite. He steps in when Flash Thompson is humiliating another student. He takes risks. He breaks rules. He talks back. He is nervous around Gwen, yes, but he is not naturally passive. Once the spider bite happens, those qualities become louder. The discovery of his powers is handled with a mixture of comedy, panic, and genuine physical confusion. On the subway, Peter cannot control his strength. He sticks to surfaces without meaning to. His reflexes react before his mind can catch up. The scene works because he is not instantly graceful. He looks like a teenager trapped inside a body that has suddenly rewritten all its rules. Then the excitement begins to take over. He climbs walls, tests his balance, experiments with movement, and gradually realizes that almost nothing around him can physically threaten him in the same way anymore. There is a rush to those moments. You can see Peter enjoying himself, maybe a little too much, and that is where this interpretation becomes interesting, because the powers do not immediately make him heroic, they make him reckless. His confrontation with Flash on the basketball court is a good example. Peter could simply walk away. Instead, he humiliates him. He uses abilities no one else understands to settle a personal score in public. The scene is staged as a kind of revenge fantasy, but there is something uncomfortable underneath it. Peter has gone from being powerless to having an absurd advantage, and his first instinct is not responsibility, it is payback. That is believable, not admirable, but believable. The problem is that the film occasionally treats his behavior with a lightness that clashes with what it is trying to say. Peter destroys property, embarrasses Flash, and acts as though normal rules no longer apply to him. Uncle Ben sees the change before Peter does. He notices the arrogance, the anger, and the way Peter is withdrawing from the people actually trying to care for him. Their arguments are among the better scenes in the film, because Martin Sheen never plays Uncle Ben like a man waiting to deliver a famous slogan. He sounds like a frustrated parent. He is trying to explain that Peter's father believed people had obligations to one another, especially when they had the ability to help. The idea is there. What is missing is the line everyone expects. With great power comes great responsibility. Now, a film should not be required to repeat a familiar sentence just because audiences recognize it. There is nothing wrong with expressing the same principle differently. The issue is that this particular phrase is not only a quotation attached to Spider-Man, it is the cleanest expression of his entire moral identity. Without it, the film has to work harder to make Peter's transformation clear. At first, he does not use his abilities to protect strangers. He uses them to explore, to show off, and eventually to hunt for Uncle Ben's killer. He is not patrolling New York because he believes the city needs him. He is searching for men who resemble the description of the thief who got away. That makes his early version of Spider-Man much closer to a vigilante driven by grief. There is anger in the way he stops criminals. He seems to enjoy frightening them. Garfield's Spider-Man is funny during these scenes, but the humor has an edge. The mask gives Peter permission to say things he would never say in school. He becomes louder, cockier, and more aggressive. In some ways, that is very close to the comics. Spider-Man is supposed to talk during fights. He distracts people, irritates them, and hides his fear behind jokes. Garfield understands that part of the character very well. Once the costume goes on, his performance loosens up. His body language becomes lighter. His voice has more confidence. He finally seems free, but freedom is not the same as maturity. The film's central challenge is showing how this angry kid becomes someone willing to risk himself for people he has never met. That progression is present, though not always as cleanly as it could be. The bridge rescue is probably the moment when the idea starts to click. Spider-Man is no longer looking for one criminal or acting out his guilt. He sees a child trapped in a car hanging above the river, and there is no personal reward for helping him. The boy is terrified, so Peter removes his mask and gives it to him. That small decision says more about responsibility than some of the film's larger speeches. Peter understands that being Spider-Man is not just about what he can do. It is also about making another frightened person believe they can survive. For once, the mask is not something Peter hides behind. It becomes a source of courage he can hand to someone else. It is one of the few scenes where the reboot finds a genuinely fresh emotional angle inside such familiar material. Uncle Ben's death is still the defining wound, of course, but the film handles Peter's grief in a slightly unusual way. He does not collapse into open mourning for very long. His pain comes out through obsession, silence, and violence. He searches night after night for the killer. He ignores Aunt May. He returns home injured and offers almost no explanation. Some viewers may find that emotionally honest. Grief does not always look like crying beside a photograph. Sometimes it looks like anger and avoidance. Still, the film moves away from the search without giving it a satisfying resolution. Peter never catches the man responsible. The storyline simply fades while the lizard plot becomes more urgent. Because of that, Peter's transition from vengeance to heroism feels incomplete. You can understand what the film wants us to believe. He begins with selfish motives, encounters situations that demand something better from him, and gradually starts helping people because it is right. But there is no single moment where Peter fully confronts the fact that revenge has consumed him. The moral change happens through accumulation rather than a decisive choice. His responsibility toward Connors is more direct. Peter gives Connors the equation that makes the regeneration experiment possible. He does it partly out of excitement, partly because of his father's work, and partly because he wants answers. He does not stop to consider what might happen if the research is rushed or placed in the wrong hands. Then Connors injects himself and becomes the lizard. That makes the conflict personal in a way the film does not always emphasize enough. Peter is not merely the only person physically capable of stopping the villain. He helped create the situation. His intelligence, curiosity, and need to understand his father all contributed to the disaster. This is where the theme of responsibility could have become especially strong. Peter's powers are not the only gifts he must learn to use carefully. His mind has consequences too. A formula written on a page can cause as much damage as a punch thrown in anger. The film gestures toward that idea, but it is busy moving into the final act, so it never digs as deeply as it could. There is also a basic contradiction in the way Peter behaves. He is intelligent enough to build sophisticated web shooters, understand complex biological research, and trace his father's scientific history. Yet emotionally, he remains impulsive. He reveals his identity to Gwen almost immediately. He ignores warnings. He throws himself from buildings before he fully understands what his powers can do. That contradiction can be frustrating, though it is also recognizably teenage. Peter may be brilliant in a laboratory and completely foolish when dealing with grief, love, or anger. Intelligence does not automatically create judgment. Garfield plays that inconsistency better than the screenplay sometimes writes it. His Peter is constantly in motion, even during conversations. He hesitates, stammers, looks away, and then suddenly says too much. There is an unsettled quality to him. He rarely appears comfortable inside his own skin, even after gaining the ability to crawl out of it and onto a ceiling. Not everyone will warm to this version. For viewers attached to the more openly vulnerable Peter Parker, Garfield can seem too confident, too stylish, or too abrasive. He does not give the immediate impression of a gentle kid being crushed by the world. Sometimes he seems like he was already halfway toward becoming Spider-Man before the spider arrived. But there is something compelling about watching power amplify flaws that were already present. Peter is angry before the bite. The bite gives him the strength to express that anger. He feels abandoned before the bite. The mask gives him another way to hide. He wants answers before the bite. His new abilities allow him to force his way into places where those answers may be waiting. The origin is therefore not simply about gaining powers. It is about all of Peter's unresolved emotions becoming more dangerous because he now has the ability to act on them. Responsibility arrives slowly. It appears when he saves the child on the bridge, when he stops seeing every criminal as a possible target for revenge, when he realizes Connors must be stopped, when he keeps moving through the city despite being badly injured. When he begins using Spider-Man not as an escape from Peter Parker, but as a way to do what Peter Parker previously could not, the film does not express that journey perfectly. It leaves the search for Uncle Ben's killer unfinished, rushes parts of the moral development, and avoids the one sentence that could have tied the whole thing together. Yet the basic idea survives. This Peter has power long before he deserves it. He misuses it, enjoys it, and hides inside it. Becoming Spider-Man means understanding that the ability to act also creates an obligation to act well. He does eventually move in that direction. It just takes the film a messier route to get him there. The mystery surrounding Peter's parents is probably the reboot's clearest attempt to separate itself from the earlier films. Instead of treating Richard and Mary Parker as distant background figures, the Amazing Spider-Man makes their disappearance part of Peter's identity. The film opens with them leaving him at Uncle Ben and Aunt May's house, clearly frightened and in a hurry, then vanishing from his life. Peter is too young to understand what is happening, but old enough to remember being left behind. That memory seems to shape almost everything he does later. He is guarded around people. He avoids getting too close. He acts like he does not need anyone, which usually means the opposite. Even his interest in science has an emotional motive buried underneath it. Peter is not only trying to understand equations or experiments, he is trying to understand his father. The old briefcase gives him a way back into that unanswered part of his life. Inside it, he finds research connected to Dr. Kurt Connors, his father's former colleague at Oscorp. That discovery sends Peter toward the laboratory, toward the spider bite, and eventually toward the entire conflict of the film. So the origin is not completely accidental this time. Peter does not simply wander into the wrong room during a school trip. His search for his parents leads him there. Curiosity brings him into Oscorp, but grief is really pushing from behind. That is a smart change because it ties Peter's powers to something personal before he even receives them. The spider bite becomes another consequence of his need for answers. In a way, the whole plot grows out of a child who never understood why his parents left. The problem is that the mystery is often more interesting than the answers the film is willing to provide. We learn that Richard Parker worked with Connors on cross-species genetics. We are told Peter's parents died in a plane crash, although the circumstances remain vague enough to invite suspicion. Oscorp clearly knows more than it is saying. There are secret files, unfinished research, and people who behave as though the Parker name still carries some danger. Then the film keeps most of that material at a distance. It raises questions very efficiently. Why did Peter's parents run? What exactly were they working on? Was the plane crash really an accident? Why does Oscorp seem so determined to continue the research? How much does Connors know? Those questions create momentum, but they are not resolved in a satisfying way. The story treats them partly as emotional background and partly as franchise bait. You can feel the film saving information for later. That weakens the mystery because Peter's search begins as the reason he enters the story, then gradually becomes secondary once the lizard takes over. His parents still matter, but mostly through implication. Kurt Connors is the bridge between Peter and Richard Parker. At first, Peter approaches him almost like a student meeting a piece of family history. Connors knew his father. He worked beside him. For Peter, that makes him more than a scientist. He is a possible witness to the life Peter never got to see. There is something sad in that relationship. Peter wants knowledge, but he also wants approval. Connors represents the version of his father Peter has built in his head. Brilliant, respected, and involved in work that could change lives. By helping Connors solve the missing equation in the regeneration formula, Peter is not just showing off his intelligence. He is stepping into his father's place. For a moment, he becomes part of the work Richard Parker left unfinished, and Peter really is brilliant. The film makes a point of that in ways the earlier movies did not always emphasize. His room is filled with equipment, photographs, and half-built devices. He modifies things. He understands difficult research. He can look at Connor's problem and see a path forward when trained scientists are stuck. The mechanical web shooters are the most obvious example. Rather than producing webs naturally, Peter designs devices that can fire a synthetic material developed by Oscorp. It is a strong choice for the character because it proves that Spider-Man is not created by the bite alone. The spider gives Peter physical abilities, but the web shooters come from his own mind. Without Peter Parker's intelligence, this Spider-Man would be much less complete. The devices also bring the film closer to the comic book version of the character. Peter is not only agile and strong, he is an inventor. His greatest advantage is not the ability to climb walls, it is the fact that he can solve problems while hanging from one. Still, the film makes the invention slightly too convenient. Peter does not create the web material itself. Oscorp has already done that. He finds the product, understands its potential, and builds the mechanism that uses it. That still shows real engineering skill, but it also feels as though the screenplay has placed exactly what he needs within easy reach. The same pattern appears throughout the Oscorp material. Peter needs access to Connors, and Gwen happens to work there. He needs advanced webbing, and Oscorp already manufactures it. Connors needs the missing scientific equation, and Peter happens to find it in his father's notes. The pieces fit, perhaps a little too neatly. Oscorp itself is treated less like a normal company and more like the hidden center of Peter's life. His father worked there, Connors works there, Gwen works there, the spider that changes Peter is there, the material for his webs is there, the technology that creates the lizard is there. Almost every road leads back to the same building. That gives the film a sense of unity, but it also makes the world feel smaller and more engineered. Peter does not gradually discover that several parts of his life are connected. The connections are stacked on top of one another. The strongest part of this storyline is the way Peter's intelligence becomes morally dangerous. When he gives Connors the decay rate algorithm, Peter does not fully understand what will happen with it. He is excited to contribute. He wants to prove himself. More importantly, he wants to take part in the work his father began. Then Connors uses the formula, injects himself, and becomes the lizard. Peter does not create the villain by himself, of course. Connors makes his own decisions. Oscorp applies pressure. The experiment is rushed, but Peter still helped make it possible. That adds another layer to the idea of responsibility. His powers are not the only thing he can misuse. His knowledge can cause damage too. Peter is intelligent enough to change the world before he is mature enough to understand what changing it might cost. The film could have explored that more deeply. There's a real story hiding there about inherited ambition. Peter worships his father's scientific work without knowing why it was abandoned. Connors is desperate to complete that work because he believes it can repair the human body. Oscorp sees commercial and strategic value in the research. Each character approaches the same science for a different reason. Peter wants connection. Connors wants restoration. Oscorp wants control. That is a much more interesting conflict than a giant reptile trying to release gas over New York. Unfortunately, once Connors transforms, the scientific and emotional complexity starts giving way to a more familiar superhero plot. The parental mystery suffers from the same problem. It begins with intimacy, a child at the top of the stairs, watching his parents leave. It expands into secret research and corporate conspiracy. Then it remains unfinished because the film is already looking toward sequels. The post-credits scene makes that intention even clearer. A shadowy figure appears and speaks to Connors, suggesting that the truth about Peter's father is still being withheld. It is supposed to create intrigue. Mostly, it confirms that this film was never planning to provide a complete answer. There is nothing wrong with leaving some mystery for later. A franchise can build gradually. But the first film still needs to make its unanswered questions feel purposeful rather than postponed. Here, the mystery sometimes feels less like a carefully designed puzzle and more like a locked box the filmmakers have not decided how to open yet. What saves the material is Peter's emotional investment in it. Garfield plays the parental scenes with a quiet frustration. Peter is not only curious, he is hurt. Every new detail brings him closer to his father and reminds him that his father chose secrecy over staying with him. That contradiction is important. Peter admires Richard Parker's mind, but he also carries anger toward him. He wants to continue his work, yet that work may be connected to the reason his family disappeared. He is trying to build an identity from someone who left him with almost nothing. Science becomes his inheritance, but also his wound. That is why the Oscorp storyline works best when it stays close to Peter. The laboratory, the web shooters, and the Connors research all reveal something about him. They show his intelligence, his recklessness, and his need to belong to a history he barely understands. When the film moves too far into secret company mythology, it becomes less convincing. Oscorp is clearly being positioned as the source of future villains and future revelations. You can see the franchise machinery beginning to turn. Names are withheld, motives are blurred. Characters appear briefly because their real purpose belongs to another movie. That makes this chapter feel incomplete. Even so, the idea behind it is strong. Peter Parker is not simply a teenager who receives powers. He is a young scientist following the trail of his missing father, only to discover that intelligence without caution can be as dangerous as strength without responsibility. His web shooters prove what his mind can build. The lizard proves what that same mind can help unleash. And the unanswered questions about his parents leave Peter in the same emotional position where he began. closer to the truth, perhaps, but still looking through a door that never fully opens. Andrew Garfield's casting is probably the point where this reboot most clearly separates itself from the Raimi films, because his Peter Parker is not built around softness. Tobey Maguire played Peter like someone the world could push around almost indefinitely. Even after gaining powers, there was still something vulnerable about him. Garfield's version carries himself differently. He is restless, defensive, and a little sharper around the edges. You get the sense that this Peter has spent years learning how to keep people at a distance. That makes him interesting, although not always immediately likable. The film introduces him as a lonely high school student, but visually he never quite disappears into the background. He is tall, stylish without trying too hard, rides a skateboard, and looks more like the quiet photography kid people might secretly find intriguing than the classmate nobody notices. That became one of the most common complaints about the performance. Garfield simply does not look like a helpless teenage nerd. He was already well into his 20s when the film was made, and there are scenes where that is difficult to ignore. Put him next to the other students, and he sometimes appears less like one of them than a young substitute teacher who has wandered into the hallway wearing a backpack. The screenplay tries to compensate by making Peter socially awkward. Around Gwen, he stammers, repeats himself, looks at the floor, and seems unable to complete a sentence without physically folding into himself. Garfield commits to those moments, sometimes so intensely that the awkwardness starts feeling performed rather than spontaneous. Still, he gives Peter a believable nervous energy. He rarely stands still. His hands move. His eyes keep searching the room. He starts speaking, changes direction, and then tries to cover what he almost admitted. There is something emotionally unfinished about him. He is clever enough to understand complicated scientific ideas, but not always capable of expressing a basic feeling without turning it into a mess. That contradiction suits this version of the character. Garfield's Peter is more guarded than timid. He can confront Flash when another student is being humiliated. He is willing to break rules, enter restricted areas, and challenge adults when he thinks they are hiding something. There is still enough good material to hold the film together. Garfield and Stone give the dialogue personality. Martin Sheen adds weight. The action provides energy when the story slows. The central idea of Peter contributing to Connor's downfall gives the conflict some personal responsibility, but the script rarely turns all of those elements into one clean, dramatic line. It keeps opening doors. The parents. Oscorp Norman Osborn, the shadowy figure, the future of the research, the next villain, the next film. By the time the credits roll, the immediate crisis is over, but the movie has left so many lights on in other rooms that the conclusion feels temporary. Maybe that was always the intention. The problem is that the Amazing Spider-Man needed to prove this new version could stand on its own before asking us to invest in everything coming after it. Instead, the franchise machinery is already running before the first story has properly finished. Mark Webb was an unusual choice to direct a Spider-Man movie, and you can feel that unusual choice in almost every part of the film. Before this, his main feature was 500 Days of Summer, a relationship film built around awkward conversations, romantic uncertainty, and people misunderstanding one another. Nothing about that immediately suggests giant reptiles, collapsing towers, or a superhero swinging through New York in 3D, yet the decision makes sense once Peter and Gwen are alone together. Webb is clearly more comfortable with two people hesitating in a doorway than with an entire city under attack. He understands nervous attraction, interrupted sentences, and the tiny shifts in body language that tell us more than the dialogue. The scenes between Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone have a looseness that much of the rest of the film lacks. They breathe. Peter looks away when he wants to say something honest. Gwen waits, amused but not impatient. Their conversations are full of pauses, stammers, and half-finished thoughts. It does not always sound elegant, but teenage attraction rarely does. Those scenes are where Webb's personality comes through most clearly. He seems interested in Peter Parker before he is interested in Spider-Man. The powers matter, obviously, but the film spends a surprising amount of time on Peter's loneliness, his parents, his anger, and his inability to communicate with the people closest to him. That focus distinguishes the reboot from a more straightforward action film. Peter does not simply receive abilities and move toward heroism. Webb treats the powers as something that disrupts an already unstable teenager. They make Peter more confident, but also more reckless. They give him freedom while exposing the anger he has been carrying for years. The quieter domestic material benefits from that approach. Peter arguing with Uncle Ben feels uncomfortable in a believable way. Aunt May watching him return home injured has more emotional weight than many of the louder scenes. Peter sitting across from Captain Stacy at dinner creates tension without requiring anyone to throw a punch. When Webb keeps the film close to those relationships, the grounded style works. The problem is that The Amazing Spider-Man cannot remain a small character drama. Eventually, it has to become a $200 million superhero movie, and Webb does not seem equally confident in both modes. The action is often technically competent. Spider-Man moves quickly, the camera follows him through difficult spaces, and several fights make effective use of his agility. The high school battle with the lizard has energy, and the bridge rescue gives Peter a meaningful heroic moment. Still, some of the larger sequences feel more manufactured than directed. There is movement, noise, and impressive digital work, but not always a strong sense of dramatic shape. A good action scene should tell us something through the way it unfolds. It should have tension, escalation, and a clear physical idea. Here, the spectacle occasionally feels assembled from whatever modern superhero techniques were available. Spider-Man swings toward the camera. The lizard crashes through walls. Objects fly through digital space. The perspective changes. Then the sequence ends. Individual moments can look excellent, but the scenes do not always build into something memorable. The film has expensive action without consistently having distinctive action. That may be the central tension in Webb's direction. His instincts are personal, while the production around him is enormous. You can imagine him being drawn to Peter as an abandoned teenager, to Gwen as someone who sees through him, and to Connors as a wounded scientist trying to repair himself. Those are all relationship-based ideas. The franchise demands something else as well. It needs a citywide threat. It needs visual scale. It needs a final tower. It needs sequel clues. It needs a version of Spider-Man that looks new enough to sell the reboot but familiar enough not to frighten the audience. The film sometimes feels like Webb is directing the emotional scenes, while a much larger corporate machine is directing everything around them. That gives the finished movie an uneven personality. There are passages that feel intimate and specific, then moments that could belong to almost any effects-heavy blockbuster from the same period. The personal material wants to slow down. The superhero material keeps pushing toward the next set piece. Webb's darker tone is part of that attempt to create a separate identity. This Spider-Man lives in a more subdued world than Raimi's version. The colors are cooler. The interiors are shadowed. Oscorp feels clinical. The sewers are wet, blue, and threatening. Even Peter's home carries a slightly heavier atmosphere. The influence of more grounded superhero films is obvious. Peter gets bruised. He limps. His costume tears. His movements are inspired by parkour and feel more improvised than majestic. He does not always land perfectly or move like an experienced hero. Sometimes he crashes into things and has to recover. That physical awkwardness is one of the film's better choices. Spider-Man is powerful, but he is not polished yet. He is still discovering what his body can do. The movement reflects Peter's age and impulsiveness. Webb also tries to make the technology feel practical. Peter builds mechanical web shooters. He experiments with materials. The costume looks like something developed rather than magically appearing. His room is filled with equipment, photographs, and unfinished ideas. These details support the grounded approach, but the seriousness can become a little self-conscious. The film often looks darker than it actually feels. There is a lot of blue light, rain, shadow, and emotional heaviness, yet the story underneath remains a fairly traditional comic book adventure. That is not automatically a problem. Spider-Man can handle sadness and darkness. His entire identity grows out of grief. The issue is that the film occasionally mistakes a serious surface for genuine depth. Putting Peter in a dim room does not automatically make his parental mystery more meaningful. Photographing the lizard in shadow does not give him a stronger motivation. Showing injuries does not solve the logical problems in the screenplay. The visual mood promises a tougher, more psychologically detailed film than the writing always delivers. And then Spider-Man starts joking. That contrast is interesting, but not always smooth. Garfield's Spider-Man is sarcastic, playful, and much more verbally aggressive than Maguire's version. He toys with criminals, talks through fights, and seems to enjoy the freedom of being anonymous. This is one area where the film moves closer to the comic book character. Spider-Man should be funny. He should irritate villains and use humor to hide fear. Garfield's loose physical performance and sharper delivery capture that side of him better than the earlier films often did. The mechanical web shooters are another comic-inspired decision. So is the greater emphasis on Peter's intelligence. He does not become Spider-Man through biology alone. He uses engineering, observation, and experimentation to complete the identity. His crouch poses and stretched movements also recall comic artwork more directly. At times, the character looks as though he has been pulled out of a panel and allowed to move through real space. For longtime readers, those details matter. They create the feeling that the filmmakers are listening to complaints about the previous series. Peter makes his webs, Spider-Man jokes. Gwen Stacy is the main romantic interest. Kurt Connors finally becomes the Lizard. The film also appears influenced by the more modern Ultimate Spider-Man interpretation. Peter's world feels contemporary, his teenage behavior is more openly rebellious, and the line between the hero's personal life and corporate science is much tighter. That fidelity is selective, though. The film borrows individual comic elements while changing Peter's overall personality. He may have the web shooters and the jokes, but he is not the same socially invisible, financially pressured Peter some viewers expect. That raises an important question. What does being faithful actually mean? Is it the costume, the gadgets, the supporting characters, the exact personality, the moral center? A film can reproduce surface details and still feel emotionally different from the source. It can also change major details while preserving the character's underlying spirit. Webb's version does a little of both. His Peter is scientifically gifted, burdened by guilt and gradually learning responsibility. That feels recognizably Spider-Man. He is also stylish, abrasive, confident, and sometimes more like a wounded outsider than a traditional nerd. That feels like a deliberate reinvention. The mix will work better for some viewers than others. There are also moments when the film's desire for comic accuracy clashes with its grounded tone. Mechanical web shooters make sense as a demonstration of Peter's intelligence, but the synthetic material appears conveniently available through Oscorp. The wisecracks fit Spider-Man, but they occasionally feel out of place in scenes photographed like a dark urban thriller. The Lizard is drawn from the comics, yet his citywide plan becomes exactly the kind of exaggerated villain scheme the rest of the film seems to be avoiding. The movie wants realism and comic book scale at the same time. Sometimes that combination works. The bridge rescue is visually spectacular, but emotionally simple. Peter helps one frightened child, and the scene stays focused on that human connection. Other times the balance collapses. The climax turns into machinery, gas clouds, and digital destruction, leaving the quieter ideas behind. Webb's best creative choice is probably making Peter's emotional life the center of the story. Even when the film becomes crowded, it keeps returning to abandonment. Peter's parents leave. Uncle Ben dies. Aunt May cannot reach him. Connors becomes a failed link to his father. Gwen is one of the few people he chooses to trust. That gives the reboot a consistent emotional concern, even if the plot does not always handle it cleanly. The weaker choice is trying to wrap that concern inside a franchise plan before the first film has finished establishing itself. You can sense multiple creative voices. The credited screenplay has 3 writers, the studio is preparing sequels, and the reboot must satisfy comic fans while appealing to viewers who only know the Raimi films. The result sometimes feels negotiated. One scene is romantic, the next is grim, then Spider-Man makes a joke, then the film pauses for parental mystery, then the Lizard returns and the building begins collapsing. It does not become incoherent, but the tone never settles completely. Raimi's films, whatever their flaws, had a recognizable personality. They were sentimental, strange, colorful, and occasionally campy. You could feel the director's particular taste in the performances, humor, and visual exaggeration. Webb's film is more polished and less eccentric. That makes it easier to take seriously in some places, but harder to love in others. There is no shortage of craft. The actors are well directed in the personal scenes. Spider-Man moves beautifully. The world is detailed. The film has a clear desire to modernize the character. What it lacks is the feeling that every part belongs to one strong creative vision. Mark Webb brings sensitivity to Peter Parker, and that should not be dismissed. The romance works largely because he understands it. The family conflict has emotional texture. Garfield is allowed to play Peter as messy rather than purely heroic. But when the film expands into spectacle, Webb's voice becomes harder to hear. The most memorable moments are not necessarily the biggest ones. Peter struggling to speak to Gwen. Uncle Ben trying to explain obligation without repeating the famous line. Aunt May silently realizing Peter is hurt. Spider-Man giving his mask to a frightened child. Those scenes have clarity because they are about people. The larger franchise material often feels like obligation, so Webb's direction is not a failure. It is a partial success trapped inside a production that requires him to be several different filmmakers at once. He can handle the teenager. He can handle the romance. He can handle grief in a quiet room. The enormous superhero machine is where the film becomes less personal, less certain, and much more familiar. Whatever else can be argued about the amazing Spider-Man, the film knows how to make Spider-Man move. That may sound like faint praise, but it is probably the clearest improvement over the earlier films. The swinging has weight, speed, and a real sense of distance. Spider-Man does not simply pass through New York while the background blurs behind him. He appears to travel through actual space. You feel the drop beneath him. The camera follows his body as he falls, catches a web, and changes direction. There is a moment of suspension, then the line pulls tight and sends him forward again. The movement has a natural rhythm to it, almost like controlled panic. For the first time in a Spider-Man film, swinging occasionally feels less like flying and more like falling very successfully. That distinction makes the action more exciting. Andrew Garfield's build helps. He is long, lean, and flexible, so this Spider-Man does not move like a heavyweight superhero. He folds into strange positions, crouches low, twists in the air, and uses momentum rather than brute strength. There is something appropriately insect-like about him. Even when the character becomes fully digital, the movement usually stays connected to Garfield's physical performance. Spider-Man lands awkwardly, scrambles across walls, and sometimes looks as though he is deciding what to do halfway through the motion. He is fast, but not yet elegant. That suits an inexperienced hero. The film also uses point-of-view shots to bring the audience closer to the swinging. In 3D or IMAX, those sequences were clearly designed to create a sensation of height. The camera looks down between buildings, rushes toward glass, and dives into open air. Some of those shots are a little obvious. You can almost hear the film announcing that the audience is supposed to lean backward. Still, the effect works. Even in 2D, the level of detail is impressive. Reflections pass across Spider-Man's suit. Buildings move around him with convincing depth. The city feels large enough that crossing it should be difficult. That is important because New York is not just scenery in a Spider-Man story. It is the space his powers were built for. On the ground, Peter is awkward and emotionally trapped. Above the streets, everything opens. The costume contributes to that physical identity. It is textured, narrow, and designed around Garfield's frame. The long limbs and slightly unusual pattern make this Spider-Man look younger and less established than the version audiences already knew. Not everyone liked the design, and parts of it do feel busy, but once the character is moving, it works better than it does in still images. The suit stretches with him, and the reflective lenses give his masked face enough expression to remain readable during action. The practical and digital elements blend well in several sequences. Peter discovering his powers on the subway is mostly comedy, but it establishes the physical rules. He cannot control what he touches. His reflexes are faster than his judgment. Every movement has an accidental consequence. Later, the skateboarding sequence lets him test balance and coordination. It is a slightly forced attempt to make Peter look contemporary, but as a piece of physical storytelling, it gets the idea across. He is learning how to inhabit his new body. The bridge rescue is where those abilities first become genuinely heroic. The sequence has spectacle, falling vehicles, webs, height, and chaos, but it stays focused on a frightened child trapped inside a car. Spider-Man cannot solve the situation by punching something. He has to remain calm and help someone else remain calm. That makes the scene more memorable than some of the larger battles. When Peter removes his mask and gives it to the boy, the effects briefly become secondary. The technology supports the emotion instead of replacing it. The later fights are less consistent. The sewer encounter with the lizard has atmosphere. It is dark, confined, and gives the creature an advantage. Spider-Man is entering the villain's environment rather than waiting for him in an open arena. The high school battle is more playful. It makes good use of corridors, walls, and changing levels. Spider-Man does not fight like a boxer. He uses ceilings, webs, and whatever objects happen to be nearby. That is exactly what his action scenes should do. The climax at Oscorp Tower has the expected scale, but it also becomes more generic. There is a machine, a countdown, a dangerous substance, and a citywide threat. Spider-Man has to reach the top before Connors transforms everyone below. It is functional blockbuster construction. The problem is that the larger the film becomes, the less distinctive it feels. Spider-Man and the lizard crash through digital environments. Pieces of the building break apart. The camera moves rapidly around them. The threat is technically enormous, yet the scene feels safer than some of the smaller moments that came before it. The outcome is never seriously in doubt. The lizard is strong enough to throw Peter around, but the fight does not have the emotional history required to make every hit matter. Peter helped create the crisis, and Connors knew his father, but that relationship remains underdeveloped. So the climax delivers movement without quite delivering tragedy. The crane sequence sits somewhere between inspiring and ridiculous. Spider-Man is wounded and struggling to reach Oscorp. A construction worker recognizes him as the person who saved his son, then coordinates a line of cranes so Peter can swing across the city. The idea is pure comic book sentiment, and honestly, there is something likable about it. Ordinary people help the hero because the hero helped them. The city becomes part of Spider-Man's recovery. That is a good emotional beat. It is also incredibly convenient. The cranes move into perfect position with remarkable speed, and the whole skyline seems to reorganize itself for one injured teenager. If the rest of the film were more openly heightened, the moment might pass without resistance. Because the reboot keeps insisting on realism, the convenience becomes harder to ignore. Still, James Horner's music pushes the sequence forward with enough sincerity that it nearly gets away with it. The score itself is uneven. Horner brings scale, emotion, and a sense of wonder to parts of the film. His music during the swinging sequences gives them lift, and the quieter themes support Peter's loneliness without becoming completely oppressive. At times, though, the score reaches too hard for grandeur. It swells before the drama has fully earned it, as though trying to convince the audience that an important superhero moment is happening. Compared with Danny Elfman's music for the Raimi films, Horner's score is less immediately recognizable. Elfman's themes had a strange, gothic energy. They felt tied specifically to Spider-Man. Horner's work is effective in the moment, but easier to forget afterward. The cinematography has a similar strength and weakness. John Schwartzman gives the film a polished, darker appearance. Oscorp is cold and metallic. The sewers are wet and shadowed. Peter's home is warmer but still subdued. New York at night looks dangerous without becoming completely stylized. The cooler colors separate this version from Raimi's brighter, more comic book world. Sometimes the look is attractive. Sometimes it feels like seriousness applied as a filter. The film wants to be grounded, so everything is darker, bluer, and slightly rougher. Peter gets bruised. The costume tears. Rain appears at emotionally appropriate moments. Yet the underlying plot still involves a giant reptile attempting to transform New York with a machine on top of a tower. There is nothing wrong with that. It is Spider-Man, but the visual realism occasionally sits awkwardly beside the material's natural absurdity. The production design does a better job of combining character and spectacle. Peter's bedroom contains cameras, scientific equipment, posters, and half-finished projects. It looks like a space shaped by a specific teenager. The Parker house has enough clutter and warmth to feel occupied. Midtown High looks modern without becoming futuristic, while Oscorp feels advanced enough to suggest a company involved in work far beyond public knowledge. The sewer environments are less subtle, but they give the lizard an appropriately unpleasant home. There is a lot of craftsmanship throughout the film. That is why calling it simply bad never feels accurate. The effects are often excellent. The cast is strong. The physical interpretation of Spider-Man is energetic and convincing. Certain action scenes understand the character very well. The film's weaknesses are not caused by laziness. They come from a lack of unity. The personal scenes belong to a thoughtful teenage drama. The visuals belong to a darker superhero reboot. The humor belongs to a more playful Spider-Man adventure. The climax belongs to a conventional summer blockbuster. The sequel clues belong to a corporate franchise plan. All of those movies are present, and they do not always cooperate. Comparisons with the Raimi trilogy are unavoidable. Raimi's first two films had weaknesses, but they also had an unmistakable personality. They were sentimental, colorful, strange, and occasionally ridiculous. Their emotions were broad, but usually sincere. The Amazing Spider-Man is more controlled. Its effects are smoother. Spider-Man is more agile. The romance is more natural. Peter's scientific ability is given greater importance. The web shooters and wisecracks bring certain details closer to the comics. Technically, it improves several things. Emotionally, it does not always improve the experience. Tobey Maguire's Peter had an immediate vulnerability that Garfield's version sometimes lacks. Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin and Alfred Molina's Dr. Octopus had stronger personalities than the Lizard. Danny Elfman's music was more distinctive. Raimi's action often felt connected to his own odd visual imagination. Webb's film is polished, but less personal once the spectacle begins. Placed beside films such as Iron Man, The Avengers, or Christopher Nolan's Batman movies, the reboot also struggles to define its purpose. Those films arrived with clearer identities. They either changed the tone of superhero cinema or delivered a kind of scale audiences had not seen before. The Amazing Spider-Man arrives between movements. It wants the grounded seriousness associated with Batman, the sarcastic energy of modern Marvel heroes, and the emotional familiarity of an established franchise. It does each of those things reasonably well. It rarely owns any of them. That does not mean the film lacks entertainment value. Once Spider-Man is fully active, there is plenty to enjoy. The movement is exciting. Garfield has charisma behind the mask. Emma Stone brings warmth. Martin Sheen gives the early story emotional weight. The movie is easy enough to watch. The harder question is whether it leaves much behind. For devoted Spider-Man fans, the comic-inspired details may be enough. Mechanical web shooters, a more talkative hero, Gwen Stacy and the Lizard offer a version of the mythology the earlier films did not provide. For casual viewers, the experience may feel like an expensive repeat with different faces. That divide explains the film better than either extreme response. It is not the lifeless disaster some critics describe. There is too much talent and too much craft for that, but it is not the bold reinvention suggested by its title and marketing either. The strongest moments are often the simplest ones. Peter and Gwen struggling through a conversation, Uncle Ben trying to reach him, Spider-Man calming the child on the bridge, Aunt May silently realizing that Peter is hurt. The weaker moments arrive when the film tries to prove how large the new franchise can become. That leaves the Amazing Spider-Man in an awkward middle position. It is visually impressive without being visually unforgettable. It is emotionally sincere without always being emotionally deep. It is closer to parts of the comics while still feeling less authentic to some viewers' idea of Peter Parker. It is familiar, but not completely repetitive. Different, but not different enough. And that is probably the fairest final judgment. This is a competent, polished, and sometimes genuinely enjoyable Spider-Man film. It contains a strong cast, excellent web-swinging, and a handful of scenes that understand exactly why the character has remained popular for so long. It also carries an underdeveloped villain, visible screenplay conveniences, unfinished franchise setup, and the constant burden of having to justify a story audiences had already watched recently. By the end, the film has done enough to survive. It never quite does enough to become essential. Watchable? Absolutely. Entertaining? More often than not. Amazing? Not really.